Welcome to the Wealth Guide podcast, where today we're thrilled to host Kev Tran, a distinguished name in property investment and a nominee for REB Buyer's Agent of the Year 2024. Kev brings a wealth of knowledge and insider expertise to help investors navigate the complex property market and achieve their investment goals. Join us as Kev shares his strategies for selecting the right market, streamlining property acquisition, and ensuring investments are both profitable and hassle-free. Whether you're looking to start your property portfolio or scale it, Kev's insights are designed to provide actionable advice tailored to your personal financial objectives. Tune in to learn how you can leverage his market-leading research and experience to make informed property investment decisions. So without any further ado, let's kick into the episode. All right, so thanks, Kev, for joining us. I was hoping you could kick us off with a little bit of your background up until this point.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Gianni. Thanks for having me on. Great to be here with you as well, Dean. So a bit of background about myself. I've been a buyer's agent for about 4 years now professionally and been a personal property investor for about 8 years. In that time, I've worked with some of the largest buyer's agencies in the country and as of recently as well, rebranded and grown my own team under my own brand.
And what about a little bit about your experience? Predominantly, what sort of sector of buyer's agency are you in?
Yeah, of course. So specifically, we buy investment properties, data-driven approach. We buy all across the whole country. Mostly a buy and hold strategy with some value add along the way. Established freestanding houses, purchase prices circa 500 to $1 million. Balance of capital growth and rental yield. And that's what we say to clients, important for your wealth creation, that capital growth is for that. But the cash flow, the rental yield is important for you to hold on to the asset, and then long-term passive income as well.
You mentioned a few terms in that: rental yield, capital growth. There's always an element of financial literacy that you need before entering into an investment. What sort of financial literacy skills do you feel people need before they even think about investing in property?
Before even going into the realm of investing in property, there's some basic things that I think every investor needs to know, which is going to be being disciplined with your money. So having good spending habits for one. Budgeting, a very simple one, for example, is when you get paid, make sure that you take a whole chunk to put towards like a buffer or savings. The surplus, the cash there is going to be used towards your wealth creation. So being real clear, not having credit cards or at least being very disciplined. There's very basic ones there.
And how does that play, Dean, especially when it comes to financial literacy in investment property? I'd imagine you'd get a lot of people asking you about how to invest in property, and what sort of investor would you recommend start investing in property, if anything? Because a lot of people would ask you, or can I, or should I, or is it a good investment? Who would you sort of guide towards somebody like Kev?
Clients that are in their wealth accumulation phase, even more a little bit towards the back end, but usually wealth accumulation phase where they're both working, good household income, not much debt on their existing principal place. And then, just utilizing other investment vehicles, for example, like investment properties. And like Kev was saying as well, it's very, very important if we're going to go down that avenue, we're buying something that's going to have that capital appreciation and growth, where sometimes, and I've seen it work both ways, but so usually clients that are in the accumulation phase.
Yeah, very good. And I'd imagine that you would have somebody who has the financial, not only literacy, but the strength to manage an additional debt through whatever equity that they've accumulated as well. And going back to those good spending habits, how do people get into those good spending habits or those good budget habits, if anything?
Kev pretty much outlined it very well. Discipline. Obviously, there needs to be discipline. Look, at the end of the day, we're all working, we're all earning an income, and then ultimately just putting a little bit aside, and then obviously instead of that extra money just sitting with a bank account earning minimal, close to nothing, utilizing something like a strategy for buying an investment, because it's got a wide range of benefits behind it. For example, we can talk about negative gearing, where we can use that as a tax deduction. We've got capital appreciation on the asset as well, so we're making a little bit of money on the back end there as well. So it does have a lot of merits, but it's important to be structured correctly and to most importantly be purchasing the right property.
And look, we're throwing a few maybe heavy terms out there as well. What's the sort of minimum in terms of financial literacy around those terms do you feel people need to understand? Like, we've thrown out rental yield, capital growth, equity unlock, what sort of minimum standard do you think people need to have, or what would you expect people to learn along the way, especially when it comes to buying their first investment property?
Borrowing capacity is a good one. So sometimes used as like serviceability. It's basically how much the bank will let you borrow, right? So the reason why we like property is because we can leverage the bank's money. So you've got a deposit, you've got a certain amount of savings, but you can buy a whole asset with like, other people's money. So borrowing capacity is a big one. And then for me, something that I learned after my first one is lender's mortgage insurance, LMI, so that is an insurance that covers the lender, not yourself. However, it kicks in when you're buying a property with less than 20% of a deposit. But what it means though is you can enter earlier. And also it's not an upfront cost. You can capitalize or add it to the loan in many cases, which is something that I didn't know for my first one, which would definitely be helpful.
Yeah, okay. And that sort of means you can get into the market a lot quicker rather than waiting to have that additional borrowing capacity. And look, let's talk a little bit about yourself as a buyer's agent. I really feel that buyer's agents are educators and mentors, especially when it comes to purchasing property, not only investment property, but owner occupied as well. How do you feel a BA assists people in terms of navigating the market towards purchasing property?
Yeah, so I think the first thing is, like you said, there's different types of buyer's agents. You've got the owner occupier ones, you've got investment focused, some with different niches within that as well. So for us, because we're purely looking at investment properties, we like to work together, say it makes sense with say investment focused mortgage brokers, financial advisors like you guys with that holistic plan. And then we can see how property can fit in with that plan, and then they can build from that. So where we help guide and kind of what we help clients do is see how they can go from one property to multiple, and what the impacts that can have on their life from a day-to-day cash flow perspective and all those things. But all those considerations you need to have as you're building out the portfolio.
Yeah, no, that's a good point, because there's a stat out there, and I'm probably getting the stat wrong, but it's roughly 60 to 70% of people are hampered. If anything, they can only purchase 2 investment properties, and they can't really get beyond that point as well. So I really feel that working with a BA will help you navigate that path that you need to get to that portfolio, that right size portfolio as well. And taking that holistic view through somebody like Dean can give you the understanding of, well, this is the path that we can take. What sort of triggers, if anything, Dean, do you reckon that people will have to say, oh yeah, investment property is a good avenue for me to reach my goals?
It's deemed somewhat as a passive investment, depending on what it's like. If you got crazy tenants in there and challenging tenants and stuff like that, but it's obviously something that you can run passively, where obviously you can have the tenant in there, it'll be looked after itself. Yes, if there's, depending on the situation with whether it's positively geared or negatively geared, how much money we've got to park aside to obviously service it. But the beautiful thing about it is it's something that you can run passive in the background. And then whilst we're running it passively, we've obviously got the capital growth around it as well, that aspect. And the more capital growth that we have, then it allows us to build more equity in the property. And then that will allow us to then speak to Kevin again and to then go buy the next.
Yeah.
So
it's a good point you made, passive as well. And because I'll tell a quick story. One of my first investment property was out at Sydney's West, and I used to go and do maintenance on it, funnily enough. And I used to go and I used to drive an hour. I used to go buy I remember I bought like washers to change the sink, and I thought, I'm going to save $100 on the plumber, but I've just cost myself 3 hours, if anything. So what are some of the biases that you find people make when it comes to purchasing investment property, especially because my initial bias was I need to buy in Sydney because I need to keep an eye on it as well. So I need to buy in, I might have had blue chip bias, or I might have had, location bias. But what are some of the biases that you find people have when it comes to purchasing property, especially investment property?
Yeah, that's a common one, exactly like that. We have this thing where we need to be familiar with where we're buying, which is true. You need to actually understand some things of where you're buying, but you don't physically need to be able to drive past it to make sure the tenants mow their lawn or all that stuff. So I think people tend to even nowadays want to buy in an area that they're familiar with. That's where a lot of issues start to come up, because especially in Sydney or capital cities, borrowing capacity, that term we used before, comes in and it's like, hey, maybe I can buy 600K. What's going to be 600K in Sydney? It's probably an apartment. And in many cases, that could be a mistake for the first investment property, which is what we see all the time.
Yeah, because especially with an apartment, I imagine there's an extra level of risk that you need to account for in the body corporate and a few other bits and pieces as well. That being said, what are some of the risks associated with sort of navigating the market alone instead of going with a BA?
Yeah, so that's one thing is firstly not being educated with basic things, and it's kind of the thing we always throw around as you don't know what you don't know. But I use myself as an example. For my first one, I bought a townhouse off the plan in Melbourne, circa 2016, when Sydney and Melbourne were seeing a boom. So I was thinking in my head, and the rationale when you explain it makes a lot of sense. You're like, hey, I've got this like 60K cash or so, borrowing capacity. I can buy something 500K. I want Sydney and Melbourne's gone through a boom, and I can't buy a house. I can afford a townhouse, which is the next best thing. It made sense to buy this investment property, but because I wasn't educated, I thought with my 60K, I could only buy something off the plan. Then I went down that route. But had I known the LMI thing, lender's mortgage insurance, I could have bought something established, not wait 2 or 3 years for it to be built, and I would have seen growth from day one. So even just a basic thing there of knowing like what your options are, that can help, kind of navigate where to go from there. So that's probably the main thing I reckon.
And I think that's so true as well, because it's more often than not, people will more likely come to you after they've made a mistake. How does that conversation go?
Yeah, so that's a big part of what we do as well. So overall portfolio assessment, and oftentimes there will be one property in a portfolio, sometimes the first one, where you realize after, or the client realizes after, hey, it hasn't grown, or like say body corporate strata fees are costing me an arm and a leg. Well, what can I do? I'm a bit stuck. It's eating into my borrowing capacity. It's cost me money. So that's when we will look at the overall picture. And we do this as well for many, say partners or say financial advisors or mortgage brokers where they've got properties or clients have properties they're not too sure what to do. We'll give some assessment and commentary around that location. So the data, what's happening nearby, and then also commentary on the actual property. So maybe it's a great location, but the asset's not very good, or it's a good location and a good asset. It hasn't performed in the previous few years because you bought it too early, but the data is looking pretty good now. So we can give some advice on what to do there.
And just provide that insight as well. Because I'd imagine, Dean, in your conversation as well, you'd speak to a lot of clients or potential clients that have investment property that haven't performed as well. What does that do to their overall, goals, or what does that do to their overall portfolio? And how do you sort of work with them to understand what the best approach is?
Funny enough, I actually have a client at the moment now that's going through that exact same situation. But whether going back to what Kevin was saying as well, is one property that may potentially hinder their overall growth or their income. Can affect their overall property aspirations. Now, for example, I've got a client at the moment now that he has a property out in Melbourne. It was something he bought many, many years ago, and he thought that it was in a good location. It was a beautiful apartment, and obviously he used that at the interim he was living in it, but then he used to obviously say, look, I'll hold on to it. It's going to be some capital appreciation in the long term. Now he's got another 3 properties that he's purchased. Every single one of them have moved except that one there, and he's looking at buying another now, but he's looking to buy a PPR, a principal place of residence, with his girlfriend now. So that property there, as nice as it was, it has had some implications, but this is the reason why speaking to a professional that actually understands the market and can give and provide a bit of insight is definitely well worth the time and effort.
Because I do speak to a lot of people that have made similar, I don't know if it's a mistake, but it's the mistake is thinking that's an investment property. When they buy a principal place of residence and then they retain it as an investment property. And people say, I've got an investment property. It's the place I used to live in. I say, well, did you buy it as an investment? And you got to think, well, no, you bought it based on emotional reasons. You sort of thought, my kids are going to grow up in the area. I'm nearby a family. I like the area. I grew up here. Whatever the reason was, there was no data in it. How do you have that conversation, Kev, to say, no, that's not an investment property, or, you should maybe consider selling it when the time is right? Do you use data in your discussion, or how does that conversation go? Sorry.
Great question. A lot of the conversations that we have will stem from that initial question you ask of what's the purpose of the property? Is it a owner-occupier? Do you want to live in it? Do you want your kids to live in it? Like, for example, if it's an apartment in Sydney or Melbourne, even though for now, because of supply issues and stuff, maybe it's not great for an investment. But if it's like a stronghold for your family into the future, you might retire into it, or all these things. Maybe it's a good idea to have that. So we always have that conversation with clients. If it's for you personally, then now all the due diligence aspects goes out the window, because there's going to be other factors that are important. Do you like living in there? Does it make you feel good? Is it close to family and all these things? So that's basically how it stems off it. But then if they're like, no, it's purely an investment decision, and we just tell them, look, it's a bad investment for A, B, C, D reasons. And then especially if they've held it for 2 or 3 years, they can see that, well, if I bought this thing over there, or my friend bought interstate, they bought a house, they've done much better, then they can really see they don't really need much convincing.
And I think that is one of the biggest things as well, because it's relatively easy to buy property and invest in property, but it's hard to do well or find the right investment property without, the benefit of hindsight or data, or understanding the data and having that sense of financial literacy as well. How do you identify those opportunities for investment? What can you talk, maybe without giving away your secret too much, but what is the high level process?
Kind of break it down to a few parts. I was saying before, we buy houses and not units. Not saying that units aren't going to perform well when they can't perform well. It's just generally speaking, and historically speaking as well, houses have outperformed units. Main kind of reason for that would be houses, or it's a land that appreciates over time. The dwelling itself, the building, it depreciates, right? And with units, you're probably one of many in a block, right? So that's the main thing that we do there. The reason why we buy established and not new, not saying you won't get growth from a new property, say a new house and land. It's just with the new estates, there isn't statistical reliability we can go off. I don't know how many owner occupiers versus renters there are. I don't know. And generally with these new estates, a lot of supply comes on board at once. So you're competing with a lot of people for it. And also some areas, there's more land to be released. So there's more supply issues potentially into the future. Whereas if you go established in pockets where there's no more land, and there's demand for it right now, there's a lot more data points that we can go off. So that in a nutshell is what we do. Then if you take a broader step back, you go, well, how do I even choose a location across the country? And then now we're going to be looking at things like from a macro perspective. You're looking at the local economy there, making sure it's quite diversified, i.e. avoiding mining towns. You want to be making sure that you're tracking unemployment rates, job ad trends, infrastructure as well, what else is happening into the area. So there's all these things that we look at from a macro perspective. And then once we kind of zoom into the actual suburbs and everything, there's all these supply and demand metrics we can look at, which we kind of discussed a bit.
Yeah. So it's really economics 101. It's, look at areas with decreasing supply and increasing demand, and then just make sure that the economy can sort of sustain people to live in that area as well, to ensure population's growing and the economy is doing well. And I think that's one of the detriments around units as well, because I've found that when talking to people, they say, I bought a unit off the plan, or I bought a unit in a high density area. I sort of think, well, what's to stop more units being developed and increasing the supply in that area? And they say, I didn't really think about that. But that's probably one of the financial literacy aspects that people need to understand. Do you often come across people that have that sort of bias, or they don't understand those sort of basic economic 101 terms when they come to purchase property?
Yeah, look, definitely. I think the way people see it is, at the moment now, given that property is, generally speaking, performing well, their view of the world is that, if I buy property, I'm never going to lose my money. I'm investing in bricks and mortar. But unfortunately, they don't understand that. Unfortunately, there are people and there are circumstances where investments don't get the returns that they anticipate, and sometimes they move backwards. But that's ultimately because it's potentially just the wrong property. It's bad timing, and there's a wide range of other factors that may have led to the lack of growth.
Yeah, no, for sure. We've talked about some holistic risks around purchasing property, but what are some of the other risks, Kev, maybe around investing in property that people don't really realize? They're not really apparent or upfront.
Another great question. So we're talking about, so far we've been talking about maybe a bit of asset selection, so going for houses and not units. And then we talked about kind of that macro perspective of how do you even choose locations, avoiding mining towns, strong economy and all these things. But even if you, say you went online and there's all these data sources and everything you can pay for now, right? Subscriptions, and they'll tell you which suburbs to buy in, the hot spots and so forth. Even if you had a list of suburbs, the next hard part is actually finding a good quality property, because you can definitely buy a house, so an established house, cool, got that, in these hotspot locations, but there will be things that I call detractors. Or red flags. So these will be things like being on main roads, right? Because they definitely have an impact on how much you can sell for in the future. Because a lot of families will avoid these busy roads. Kids can't play in the front yard and all that. Flood zones, bushfire risk, public housing. These are all important things that can obviously affect safety. And then any other detractors. So you don't really think about it, but if you're right in front of a bus stop and every day, there's a bus stop in front of your house and there's people, kids and everything, you're not going to like it. Roundabouts as well. Yeah, there's a long list that we'll go through, and then things that you don't really think about, but like random commercial, industrial properties. For example, I rejected a property, this was sometime last year. We got pretty close to it, but it was still part of our checks. It passed everything else. Wasn't on a main road, blah, blah, all that stuff. We looked on the Google Maps and probably 600 meters away or so, there was this commercial building. So we would have to do a bit of digging around what it was. Turned out it's an abattoir. It's like a slaughterhouse. And 600 meters, it's kind of far enough. We asked our local contacts there, property managers and so forth, and they said, yeah, you want to avoid that one. Okay. It smells. 600 meters probably just at the border, but avoid that. The funny thing was, there were 3 other buyers agents going for it. Okay. We were like, oh, wow, it's a crack of a property. It's fairly priced as well. We kind of started digging into it, but yeah, I'm quite sure another buyer's agent bought that.
Yeah, wow. It's the best that you've rejected, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah. That's like
didn't pass the nose test.
Exactly. Exactly. But that's exactly the stuff that you'd have to go into to make sure that, 6 months, 12 months down the track, it's not going to come bite you in the bum.
Yeah, for sure.
It seems the process that you guys take is very quite detailed, and you guys do a lot of due diligence when looking at these properties, which I think your everyday person, probably half of the stuff they might not look into, which is good.
I say to clients as well, like for us, it is a long-term thing. Most clients want to build a portfolio. We want to be there along the journey. Like selfishly for me is if you're happy with your team and you're getting a result, hopefully you'll come back. Come back to myself, Dean, mortgage broker, whoever it is, and we'll keep building that portfolio together. So there's no point in me buying one property and then making a mistake, and then 6 months later we're all realizing that, and then you don't come back. So.
Yeah, because it's almost like selfishly you want the customer to do well, and that's not a bad thing, if anything, because you have aligned interests. Same as a financial planner, you want them to do well because then their assets will grow and you continue to maintain their portfolio as well. So that being said, we talked a little bit about long-term strategies. What's the predominant long-term strategy that you're using with your client?
Yeah, so I guess the reason why a lot of people come into property is because it's relatively passive. Of course, you will get maintenance issues. Yeah. You will get tenancy issues down the track. But the majority of the time, it's kind of set and forget.
Unless you get an idiot like me, go and change your washers or something. Yeah.
The owner wants to come in and then change the light bulb and check out his house. But yeah, that's kind of the main reason clients want to come into it. Obviously, all the leverage and all the beautiful things that we have, negative gearing and tax concessions. But clients are busy. That's why they engage us. They also don't want to be, actively working on these investments. So long-term buy and hold can get them to their goals. We also have some other strategies as well to kind of increase manufacturer growth. So renovation potential, once there is some equity and growth there, potential to add a granny flat in the background, subdivision potential. But then a lot of the time, after we've built that residential base and had that capital growth into the future, we can look at things that are more like income driven. Like for example, whole unit blocks or commercial assets, where the capital growth may not be as strong, but now the rental income is going to be significant. So these are kind of the strategies that we can look for.
And I suppose, Dean, it's that initial conversation around the particular goal and what you need to achieve that goal. Because when I'm talking to people, I often use the example, like I wouldn't recommend negative gearing to a low income earner because they don't have the cash flow to maintain the deficit. And then you wouldn't recommend positive cash flow to a high income earner because it's just going to add to their tax burden.
Correct.
So how do you go about aligning the right strategy to the right goal as well?
Look, so basically what we do is I get an understanding of the client situation, what are their income needs, what are their overall growth needs, and then off the back of that, then we can obviously make sure we try to drum up some strategies for them to actually get to where they want to be. And I think exactly what you're saying as well. Like if we've got a client that's a high income earner, then ideally we would want to have them in a position where they've bought this asset and it's negative geared so that they can claim a tax deduction. It doesn't make sense for a high income earner to be positively geared and just increasing their taxes. And also on the other side as well, if we got someone that's just quite young and wants to buy a property and there's not much in income there, trying to get something for them more on the either neutrally geared or closer towards the positive side of things would obviously make more sense for them. So we bring up the client and their goals together, and then after that we try and create that strategy for them.
And then the next step would be to pass on that information to Kev, and Kev would use that understanding to then, okay, let's go into asset selection mode. What is your next step from there? Like, you understand their goals, what they're looking to achieve, you go into asset selection mode. What's the next step from there?
Once we go into we've confirmed the brief, that'll also include talking about which locations they're comfortable with.
Yeah.
So every step of the way, it's going to be for the clients to decide. Our job is to best guide them. From there, we're going to start the search. So my team and I, outbound calls to real estate agents is kind of like the main day-to-day activity that we do. At the moment, the majority of the deals that we are doing are off-market, just because anything that's going online is just too crazy, too chaotic. So those relationships with agents can potentially get us these off-market deals and avoid competition and so forth. Then we'll go through that process that we did before. Once we get an address, due diligence checks, make sure there's no detractors. Once that's done, we'll do a comparable analysis. So we're looking at some superior properties, some that are similar, inferior. Then we can get a range on what we feel it's worth. Once we have that, then we can do a cash flow analysis. So going back to make sure that it aligns with the overall financial strategy, make sure that the client can handle if it's a negative cash flow position, all that stuff. And then if the clients like it, we'll go pursue the property, get a video inspection, and do the next steps.
Today's episode of the Wealth Guide podcast is proudly sponsored by Ryker Capital. In a world full of financial uncertainties, Ryker Capital understand the importance of safeguarding your lifestyle and the well-being of your loved ones. That's why we're committed to providing you with personally tailored insurance plans and financial advice that aligns with your unique needs and goals. Ryker Capital is your guide in the complex world of superannuation and retirement planning. Our team of experts are dedicated to helping you navigate these complexities with ease and confidence. We're here to empower you with the knowledge and strategies you need to build wealth and secure your future. At Ryker Capital, we offer a comprehensive range of services designed to optimize your superannuation. We work closely with you to determine the best contribution strategy, regularly review your superannuation fund, set achievable financial goals. Our coaching and consulting services ensure your financial plan stays on track with regular reviews to adjust to your changing circumstances and aspirations. Don't leave your financial future to chance. Take control today with Ryker Capital. Contact us for an obligation-free discussion about your financial plan by calling us on 1300 179 537. Let us help you secure your finances because you deserve it. Ryker Capital, your trusted partner in financial success. Are off-markets all that they say to be? I seem to feel that people put off-market properties on a pedestal, but are they all they say that they are?
Yes and no.
Yeah.
So definitely a buzzword nowadays. People like to throw it around, similar with the other term that you guys know I hate, which is under market, under market value.
Yeah.
But off market. So just to define what that is at the moment. So anything that goes on the major portals, realestate.com, domain.com, that's what we call on market. And anything else that sells outside of that, I would consider off market. With off, there's probably two subcategories. You've got pre-market, which is where the vendor is already intending to go online. They're going to go online and sell it, but they still need to take photos, still need to pay a few $1,000s to go on the portals. So if you can get in earlier, you got a bit of a sneak peek, maybe you can beat the competition. That's one. A true off-market is where the vendor has no intention of going online. It could be distressed. So that maybe they have some financial troubles, they're in debt. Maybe there's been a death in the family or there's been a divorce. So now the last thing they want is to pay money, have photos, go on, like it's a few $1,000s to go on the portals, then have a whole bunch of people through their house, and all these things, very disruptive. So if we can come in earlier with the opportunity, do our checks, and then it's actually a good deal, then we can beat the competition and do an off-market deal. Oftentimes, what I figure out is that these off-markets, they're not distressed. And the vendor actually just wants top dollar without paying for marketing. They want to keep their house, not presented well. And if they get a really good offer, then they'll take it off the market or they'll sell it. So for us, we need to make sure that, we've got the vendor expectations and it's aligned or to a level where we can do a deal.
Yeah, I'd imagine that's probably one of the biggest problems with off markets as well. They're just sort of testing the water to see if they can get the price that they want without having to spend thousands on marketing.
That's a big one as well.
Yeah.
So as a buyer's agent, and this is what I tell the guys in our team, is there are certain questions you can ask to find out and try to mitigate being that test bunny. You know, the last thing you want is get your client all worked up to do a deal. And sometimes they are very nice properties and you're like, oh, I really like it. Client's getting excited. And it turns out, you know, they took your offer and now they know the benchmark. Now they go online or they try to get a better offer than that. So there's ways around it. But, you know, if you're inexperienced, it could happen as well. So
yeah, 100%. And I guess that's probably one of the benefits of using a buyer's agent as well, because not only do you get access to those off-market properties, but you get to weed out the sort of, you know, fake off-markets, if anything, or the looky-loos or that sort of stuff, the people that are just curious about their property's value. If we can take a step back maybe to anything, what advice would you give to somebody who has just sort of decided that, you know, investing in property is appropriate for me and my goals? What is their first step from that point? So I've made the decision. What do you sort of recommend I do there?
Definitely need to speak to someone around their financial lending position. So either directly with the bank or a broker. I always recommend going to a broker only because they can assess different lenders for you and, you know, recommend you, especially a mortgage broker with an investment, either portfolio themselves or they help a lot of clients do the same. From there, you can understand things like your borrowing capacity, if your goals are to build a portfolio longer term. And then from those questions, maybe, like you guys said, kind of alluded to, is there are particular strategies we can take depending on what your end goal is, you know, so then you can start going, or do we buy in personal name? Do we potentially buy in different entities? And then that's when other professionals like yourself, maybe accountants, can come into the picture. And we can talk about other things as well.
And I'd imagine, especially because of social media and influencers, then you get a lot of people thinking that investment property is the right way. But how do you sort of have that conversation to decide, you know, yes, investment property is right for you, or no, it's not appropriate for you? What's that conversation like?
Once again, it depends on their stage in life. I've had clients that are running up towards retirement and they don't have too much money in the bank, and it's like, okay, we want to buy an investment property. I'm never going to forget this. Actually, I remember this was a couple of years ago. I had a client that walked into my office. This is when I used to work in the bank, and he had, I think at the time, it was in Sydney. I think he had around about 2 properties. Having a chat with him, and I was like, look, what are your long-term goals? What are your retirement goals? And he's like to me, look, he goes, I've got these properties. I'm just going to live off the rent. It's like, okay. And when are you wanting to retire? He goes like to me, I want to retire in the next, say, 3 to 4 years. I go, okay, no problems. And then going through his net position, with these properties that he had, he would have had, and this was back then, was still like, it was a decent value in property size. I think it was like $2 million, right? But he still had over $1 million, or close to, or just under $1 million in debt. So it's like, okay, well, great, makes sense. But then the problem is, if we take a step back, you may be making $70,000, $80,000 a year in rental income. But have you forgotten about the $1 million in debt? Are you going to service? Are you going to live on $100 a week? So, look, I think people get very, very passionate. They get very excited. I think speaking to the right financial professional to actually help them through that journey. And I've seen as well, I'm a massive advocate for a buyer's agent. Personally, because I've seen many times where clients go in and they buy property and they're thinking that they're doing the right thing, but it's actually ended up being quite detrimental.
Yeah.
So seeking that professional advice is so important.
I think that's the difference between any buyer's agent and a good buyer's agent, because in particular, Kev, you talked about mapping out the process of building a portfolio. So it's easy to enter into a lot of investments actually, but it's hard to get out of it, because once you get out of the investment, we see all these implications, especially, you know, estate planning, CGT, taxes, and sometimes even fees to get out of an investment, let alone an investment property. And that being said, you really need to understand how you're going to get out. And, you know, because once you've achieved your goal, you're all right, I need that money now, I've got to get it out. But that can often be to your detriment as well. So working with a buyer's agent, specifically an investment property buyer's agent, to map out that portfolio is, you know, the difference between any buyer's agent and a good buyer's agent as well. Let's pull it back to the investment property market. At the moment, we're in a situation where we're seeing capital growth in a number of areas, and we're in an economic environment where we've got high interest rates. What other trends are you seeing in the investment property market?
Yeah, there's probably a few I can think of, and it's gonna all go all over the place here. So one trend I've definitely been seeing a lot more the last, say, 12 months, self-managed super funds coming up a lot more than I was the 3 years prior. Potential reasons there, maybe borrowing capacity has been tapped out for a lot of people. So you can buy one in your super without affecting your borrowing capacity. Perhaps also some super funds haven't performed as well. There's probably a few reasons there, but that's definitely a trend that I'm seeing. Buying in family trusts as well. I'm seeing a fair few more of that, probably going along that borrowing capacity route that we talked about, because some benefits of that is not just asset protection, but can potentially extend that borrowing capacity. In some cases, some lenders will exclude the debt in some trusts. And then from a property kind of market perspective, some trends that we're seeing now is, or I'm seeing anyway, is data is looking pretty good for Melbourne or Victoria in some parts. It's counter-cyclical because right now more people are selling than investing into Melbourne, but the data does look quite promising. Got a population in Melbourne that's circa the same as Sydney. Rents have grown significantly because of the exodus of investors. Rental or land tax changes recently have come into play. But basically now you've got median house prices, which haven't really moved much in the last few years. You can get out of suburbs of Melbourne, freestanding house, 700K with like a 4% rental yield, which is growing. So potentially you can buy before there's going to be a massive influx of new investors. So that's definitely a market trend I'm seeing.
Yeah, and I assume that, Victoria has received a lot of bad press recently because of those policy changes as well, land tax. The other one was the Airbnb tax, or the short-term rental tax that they were looking to. So as a result, a lot of investors would have pulled out. But that's coming back to that economics 101 around, decreasing supply of investors means fewer rental properties. And as a result, the property market has been a little bit stagnant. Is that the trend that you're seeing?
Yeah. So on an investment perspective and rental supply, yes. So because there's been less demand there, and also there's been quite a bit of an exodus, people selling these assets, less rental stock, supply and demand means higher rental increases. And that will kind of like cycle and balance out where people will start to realize that the rental growth is quite strong and potentially enter back in. But the wider market, the owner occupier market as well, I can definitely see that potentially changing into the future.
Yeah, okay. And I want to talk about as well, you mentioned a little bit around SMSFs and trusts. That's not something that a newbie investor should consider, Dean, as well. Like, if anything, what are the considerations do they need to take into account before they set up these big structures like self-managed super fund and family discretionary trusts?
Look, there are particular requirements in certain aspects, and sometimes and they can be quite costly to set up, to be honest. Now, it only makes sense depending on your circumstances whether these structures are correct for you. Now, for example, with a self-managed super fund, what ASIC have come back and they've put as a blanket rule that you can't set up a self-managed super fund, or they don't recommend to set up a self-managed super fund with anything less than around about 250,000, right? So there are specific milestones that need to be met before we can have these structures so that it can obviously make sense and you've got that capital growth that you're looking for.
And it also the purpose of the investment as well, because we sort of talk about, well, we're buying under that entity for a particular purpose. So it really needs to align with your goals as well.
Correct. So it needs to be fit for purpose at the end of the day.
And then getting it wrong. So purchasing the wrong investment asset, coming back to Kev now, I just buy any old property inside my self-managed super fund can actually have a big detriment on my goals. I suppose that asset selection process is even more important in self-managed super fund, particularly because, that money is reserved for your retirement. So getting that wrong, what sort of an impact does that have, Dean, maybe on a person's portfolio or a person's goals?
Yeah, look, whether it's a property purchased within a self-managed super fund or whether it's within your personal name, as long as a bare minimum, your principal place, right? We can't really afford to go into retirement with debt. So if we've got a property within a self-managed super fund and we've still got massive debt off the back of it, and now we've retired and there's no income coming in, we're supposed to be using that asset within the self-managed super fund to fund our living expenses, right? Now, if that's not structured correctly, then it can be quite detrimental. But also as well, we've invested so much time, effort and money in buying this asset within the self-managed super fund. We need to make sure that it's actually tracking to where it should be and it's actually worth the investment. It's worth our time. And hence why, and I've said this before, it is so imperative and it's so important to make sure if you're going to be looking and you're going to be going down that avenue, it can be quite rewarding. But at the same time as well, if it's not done correctly, it can be quite detrimental. Like the last thing you'd want is that all this time and effort that you've put in structuring and creating these structures and buying these assets and all that type of stuff for it to only either close to nothing, there's close to no or minimal movement, or even potentially going backwards.
Yeah.
So
that makes sense. I'll just add to that one as well, Dean. From an asset selection point of view for a self-managed super fund purchase, because there are limitations of what you can do in a self-managed super fund. For example, you can't really like take out the growth there and refinance for equity, right? Whereas you could do that if you were buying outside of super. Things like renovations or value adds for properties is something that we don't really do. So when you buy a property, of course, it'll be maintenance in a self-managed super fund, but we don't want to be buying things that in 7 years or say 5 years, you need to update the kitchen or the bathroom because, it doesn't really make sense on that side.
Yeah, because there's big restrictions inside self-managed super fund as well. It needs to be an arm's length. It can't be like an Airbnb that you visit on the weekends or something like that, or you can't invest in something that you're going to start personally using, as well as the tax implications as well, because tax inside superannuation environment is much different to in your individual name. So I feel, if anything, the plan that the both of you take is instrumental in ensuring that they meet their goals before retirement, like you said, because we want to make sure that we don't have debt, and also to make sure that we're buying the right asset that's fit for purpose as well. Now, we talked a little bit about the trends, but how do you feel investors can best position themselves to take advantage of these trends for when they do come along? For when you sort of say, well, hey, I'm noticing a trend here. This is what you can do to prepare yourself.
So when it comes to like locations, this is where for certain investors, you can be armed with understanding. So with Melbourne, for example, and talking about how it's counter-cyclical buying, it's really just like understanding where a market sits in its market cycle. Some right now not seeing some fantastic growth. However, that means that if you buy now, the pressure is not so strong. So it's more of a buyer's market potentially. Whereas if you buy in a market where it's a seller's market, potentially they're seeing some strong growth now. So there's pros and cons of why you would go in certain markets. But if you have a plan to buy multiple properties, and say, for example, with the first one or two, you're buying in these heated markets because you want that short-term growth, potentially as you diversify different locations, maybe you can throw in one where it's not super heated. So you could beat the rush, beat the crowds. You're going to have better buying conditions, and that way as well, you can ride the full wave of the next cycle. So that's how an investor, if you're confident about where you're buying and which and where they're sitting, then you can get that benefit.
And I suppose to take advantage of those market cycles as well, you'd always have to keep your eye on the data. Like you'd have to be heavily exposed, heavily invested in just reading and understanding. And it almost comes back to that piece around financial literacy as well. But Dean, if people are looking at getting invested in property and they do want to take advantage of these property cycles, maybe same question for you, how do they best prepare themselves?
Look, I think it's a massive, there's a wide range of steps. I think first things first, understanding what their income and expenses look like to see whether or not they can, before they even go to the bank, do they feel like they can financially afford to be able to invest into something? Once they've done that, then I'll probably say the next step for them is to obviously have a chat to a bank or a broker and just get an understanding, okay, well, what is my borrowing capacity? What does that actually look like? Will the bank, now I know that I can save some money. Now on the back of that, will the bank really lend me any money, right? And then once they've understood that, then after that, they can then engage with someone like Kevin as well, just to try and help and assist them with which is the best way to structure it. Where should I buy? What does it all look like? But then most importantly as well, in that process as well, then speaking to someone there and just getting some professional advice to make sure, is it structured? How are we going to structure it? Is it going to be structured correctly? What are the implications and so on and so forth? And once again, look, with what we do as a profession, I think we work as a team. I think for me to be able to justify and provide the client the best possible advice and get them to that journey to success, I need someone like a broker to help clients with making sure they get the best lending, They need a great accountant to make sure that they've obviously, when it comes to do their tax returns, everything's structured in the most effective way. And most importantly as well, when it comes down to, okay, well, where are we going to actually physically buy? It's important to have someone like Kevin there to actually help and say, okay, well, look, we've done the research for you. We've done the hard yards. We've looked into the data. We understand the trends. And based on what we've got, this is what it looks like. And especially now as well, the fact that when we're buying property, depending on how many you look at purchasing and all that type of stuff, we're putting a lot of hope onto this one particular asset, right? So if we're putting a lot of hope within this one particular asset, we can't afford for it to go wrong, right? Hence why it's just as important to actually make sure you get and you speak to someone to make sure they steer you in the right direction.
And I'm sure that's part of the conversation as well. Like when you're saying this is the portfolio that we're going to build and this is how we're going to diversify it as well. I'm sure that's like when you look at mapping that, you'd sort of take that into consideration, especially with things like land tax.
Yeah, absolutely. So when a client comes on board with myself initially, it depends on where they come from, right? Because sometimes they reach out to me first, they might reach out to Dean first or a broker, for example. But we'll give our kind of like initial thoughts. But then based on what that conversation looks like, it's like, well, hey, you're looking for some holistic overall, planning. You need to speak to Dean, and then kind of like then from there we can work out that overall strategy. Because there are things that I can't advise on, and we can work off that. Yeah, having that team is so important.
Yeah, it's all about like we said initially, having that team of professionals behind you that have aligned interests as well, not just having anyone in your corner, sort of thing. So. Look, gents, really appreciate your time. Kevin, thank you for your insights today. Last question for you. If anybody has any other questions, how's the best way to get in touch with you?
Yeah, thank you. So easiest way would be just on my website, kevtran.com.au. Also, you can find all the social handles as well, KevTran.
Awesome. Thanks, gents, for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The information provided in this podcast is for general information purposes only and should not be considered as personal advice. Always consult with a qualified professional or expert in the relevant field for personalised advice tailored to your specific situation.
If you enjoy the content we bring you on the Wealth Guide podcast, we'd love for you to subscribe and share with your community. Let's grow this community together and make financial literacy accessible to all.